thank you for joining me once again, Dr. Jason W. Morrison, theologist. You can see the light today is red. The sun is like blood red over here at the moment with the bushfires and everything going on. But I want to keep moving with my studies on the Watchtower, given that, interestingly, the Jehovah Witnesses were down at the waterfront today right on sunup. I don't know why. I think they're just clocking up hours. There was no one there, and they weren't in the mood to talk to me today, so I just kept going. But we're going to look at the origins of the Jehovah Witnesses. We've got a couple of channels that I've found. The Smurf girl, who by generation is an ancestor of the original Watchtower people. She's got some really interesting insights into the early beginnings of the organisation, probably insights that you won't hear from anybody else. And then we've got Eric Wilson, who brings on James Penton, who speaks about the origins of the teachings of the Jehovah Witnesses. So on the one hand, you have Smurf Girl, who on the inside knows things that you just won't hear from people outside this kind of contact with the origins of the organisation. And then, of course, we have Eric Wilson, who brings on James Penton. And might I just say, Eric Wilson's channel's the Berean Pickens, so I'll put the links to these below. A lot of people don't know that Charles Taze Russell was divorced either on grounds of pedophilia. I find this really interesting. You can read this from a YouTube channel called Watchtower Lies, and I'll put the link to this below. But a lot of people don't know that Charles Taze Russell was a pedophile, and this contributed to his consequential divorce from Maria. She couldn't take it. He was warned and he carried on. They've even got a record of the testimony taken from the official report of the case on file relative to Charles Taze Russell's case. A lot of people don't know also that Judge Rutherford personally had a Watchtower coup. He took over the Watchtower via a personal coup. And there's so many things that these Jehovah Witness people don't know. Mrs. Russell had to make an inquiry into Charles Taze Russell's income because he promised to give her nothing after she divorced him. And we're talking about a very wealthy man. He must have been a terrible Scrooge. And let's not forget the Australian Royal Commission either, which brings to light the attitudes and the outlooks and the concepts and policies of this Jehovah Witness-ism cult. Now, I call it Jehovah Witness-ism because it's no different to Satanism or any other religious fanaticism. So I've come up with the name and I'm going to stick with it, Jehovah's Witness-ism. So without further ado, I think we'll turn to Smurf Girl. An interesting person indeed. I'll just sort this out now and we'll go to Smurf Girl.
Hey guys, how's it going? It's me, Smurf Girl. So I've had the hardest time trying to make this video. I don't even really know why. Well, I mean, I do know why. But it's about Watchtower and my family history and the connections of who's really running Watchtower. That's really what this video is about, is everybody wants to know who's really, running Watchtower. And at the beginning of my channel, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to jump head in and I'm just going to start talking about my family right away and what went on in Watchtower. And I got just scared. I'm like, I can't talk about this. I really can't. And so I made those videos private because I just couldn't, because I spoke with my dad and seeing his reaction engaging his reaction and thinking Watchtower's reaction is going to be even worse. The repercussions, because when I start talking about my family, they're going to be able to connect the dots about who I'm talking about. Like if I'm specific enough and I say certain things, they're going to know exactly who's talking. And that really freaked me out. So it took me like a whole year, but I'm basically ready. So here goes. I'm from what Watchtower calls a shareholder family. And they also call it a first family or an original family. And that's one of the families that goes all the way back to the beginning, where my great-great-grandfather was one of the original members. And he was actually school friends with Charles Taze Russell. And so their families were close and, going to the same school and that sort of thing. And they were both from wealthy families because Charles Taze Russell admittedly is from a wealthy family. And so with the International Bible students, prior to 1914, that was a pivotal year. A lot of things changed, especially after Russell died. But in 1914, a lot of things changed. But prior to 1914, it was a very exclusive group. You couldn't join back then like you can join nowadays. And even now you have to jump through hoops and go through all those questions to get baptized and stuff. So if you can imagine the way it is now, where you have to go through the questions and go through a Bible study and do all this stuff, it was even more exclusive back then, where you basically had to be chosen, like handpicked by Russell. He had to deem you worthy enough to join the International Bible Students, which is what the Jehovah's Witnesses used to be called, before you could join, because you were known as one of the anointed. All of them were of the anointed back then. So he had to see and deem you worthy enough. And those original members, and everything I talk about, I'm going to show you in Watchtower's own literature what I'm talking about, because they'll talk about it, but most people don't even understand what they're saying. If you don't have family members from back then and you don't realize what they're talking about. So that's what I want to do. I want to connect the dots and show you what was actually going on and who's actually running the whole entire thing. And so when from the very beginning, what he was originally looking for that 1914 generation were shareholders to fund Watchtower, to fund his printing company. And so what I want to first do is take you to the Proclaimer's book. I have it right here. There's the Proclaimer's book, and it's, let's see, page 228. And it's in this paragraph. The Society's charter set out a shareholder arrangement in which each aggregate contribution of $10 entitled the contributor to a vote in connection with selection of members of the board of directors and officers of the society. And so the society's charter is the way it originally was. That's what they mean by that. And really, it wasn't necessarily a contribution. They use that word, but what it was an investment of $10. And you got one vote. Well, what they're not including in that paragraph is that you also got a cut of the profits because you were a shareholder. You were a private shareholder. It wasn't on the stock exchange, but it was private shares. And so he was looking for investors. And one of the benefits of buying these $10 shares was you got a vote for investors. And one of the benefits of buying these $10 shares was you got a vote in Watchtower, but you also got a yearly check based off of donations. And well, not donations, based off of sales, because back then it was different than it is now, where Charles Taze Russell is known for saying the day that we have to set out a collection plate is the day that we close our doors, because they sold the literature. They sold the studies in the scriptures for quite a bit of money. I think it was the equivalent of today's money was about $59 for the set of studies in the scriptures. It was expensive back then. And if you bought the entire set, you actually got a free chart of the ages, that pyramid poster. That was the incentive for buying the entire set all at once, just like encyclopedia salesmen. And they sold subscriptions to the Watchtower magazine. And subscriptions are about the equivalent of like $22 in today's money. So that's quite a bit. It was just a little tiny magazine, almost like a thick newsletter. So to have in today's money, I think it was like $1 back then or something like that. But in today's money, it would be about $22 for a subscription to Watchtower back then. And so that's how they made their money. And these original 1914 generation shareholders, they got a check where they basically all split the profits. Where Russell he owned 51% of the shares, so that there could never be a hostile takeover. So there was only 49%, so that even if everybody sold their shares to one person, they could never completely take over the company. And that's usually the way when you have a private shareholder situation, that's the way it goes. And it was my great-great-grandfather, of course, and he was a great businessman. He knew he wanted to have an influence in the vote, and so he bought several shares, like several, and also enough so that he could pass them down to his children. He bought several, and as an investment. And so that's basically who Watchtower entrusts to be on the writing department, on the governing body, at the service desk. That's who they entrust, because they are literally getting a share of the profits. And now it's a little different. As of the 1980s, when they stopped asking for money for the literature, for the 25 cents is what Watchtower was back then, then it changed. But those are the ones who go to the annual meeting. The annual meeting is basically a meeting of the shareholders. And so I want to show you, there's another article where I can connect the dots, and I have to go to the online library because I don't have the actual hard copies, but it's the 1955, the March 15th, 1955 Watchtower. And it's in this obscure little article, the 1914 date verified part 6. And in the middle of this paragraph right here, it says 600 attended the business meeting on Saturday, January 6, 1917, where approximately 150,000 votes represented in person or by proxy were unanimously cast for Rutherford for president, Van Amberg for secretary treasurer, and Pearson for vice president. And so that's exactly what they're talking about right in the Proclaimer's book, is they had votes for the board of directors and the officers of the society. And that's what they're talking about here, is the president. Well, and they call it a business meeting in this article. Well, there's a footnote right here, and they'll always hide things in the footnotes. So it's always important to read the footnotes. It says the corporation's former voting arrangement was that of one vote for every $10 donation to the society. So there's the connection. What they're talking about is this $10 for every vote is exactly what they're talking about, the shareholder arrangement. That's what they're talking about in here. Well, if you notice, 150,000 votes were cast and only 600 attended. You have to just guess at how many were sent in by proxy, of how many members and however many several shares each one of them owned, because every single one of them owned several shares, just like my great-great-grandfather. And so if each vote of those 150,000 shares was $10, think about that, because Russell this is 1917. There's another article somewhere where it specifically says that during this vote, Russell's shares were not used because he was dead. And so his shares were not in effect. So every single one of these 150,000 votes cost $10. That's $1.5 million. And they were all sold prior to 1914. That's in today's money. This is going to shock you because it shocked me. In today's money, that is the equivalent of about $50 million. Between only 600 attended. So even if we double that half of them couldn't attend the annual meeting. $50 million donated by that few of people.